So my sabbatical project emerged out of a long-standing research project that I've had. It's a project that goes back to before actually my dissertation. It includes my dissertation. Um, and it's one that has been pieces of it have been published in various forms, and that kind of was the root of the problem for me. Was that for years and years and years I've had all these different pieces, and they've been finished, some pieces, and new pieces not finished, and I've done research in some places and not in others, and benefited from a lot of RSC grants, which has been fantastic. Um, but what I really needed was some space and time to put it together, and so the sabbatical gave me the leeway to look at it and decide whether I actually had a book project left, whether it was just a bunch of pieces and essays, which would have been fine. Those are some of the more influential ways to get out ideas, but I kind of wanted a book, and it. When I looked at it, there was a book there. There was still a book there. It was a different book than I had thought it would be, and so it centers on the New Deal, and on the Federal Writers Project, which was one of the New Deal cultural projects. And so I got really interested in the way that there are all these ideas about pluralism in there, that in the guidebooks there's this idea that I call civic pluralism, which is basically that if you have contributed to the nation's past, no matter what your background, then you have a place in the nation's future. And that's a really democratic idea and kind of a neat one. But it also runs into conflict with this other idea, which is another progressive idea, which was about modernization, which is the idea that if there are problems in the nation, one of the ways that you fix them is spatially, that you go in and you rework the space that is causing the problem. And so I got interested in how those were being written into the books. But I also got really interested in how writers who were involved in writing for the Federal Writers Project were thinking about those issues in their own work. And so I became particularly interested over time in African American writers, because so many of them were either finishing their career or getting a second lift on their career. And so I get really interested in how, in their own work after the New Deal, in their fiction and in their documentary work, they are writing ideas about what the nation is and what liberalism is and how to move forward, which often come into contrast with the ideas put forward by the New Deal itself and the Federal Writers Project. The title of the book is Dark Mirror, the New Deal in African American Literary Countermodernities. Countermodernity is basically an idea I'm borrowing from Michel Foucault that suggests that implicit in our idea of modernity is this kind of break between the past and the present. And African Americans have a lot less interest in that kind of a break. That it's important for the writers that I look at to keep memories alive of injustice, while also drawing on things that they learned in the New Deal about African American history. But then in their own work, they use it to contest the idea that the federal government has to be the place where things get fixed. And this, I think, is really important, because one of the things they're suggesting is that if the state, if the federal government is going to be the agent of change, that it may need to go about it in different ways. And I think that that's a really important political insight from the literature that I'm looking at. So.
We decided to add a more data science component to our actuarial science major, and to add the data science major, it became apparent that in web work, this homework hosting system that's used worldwide had no questions specifically for data science. And so, because I have a coding background, in my first career I was a computer programmer analyst, and because there was this need in academia for questions in this homework delivery system, my intention was to author those questions. And so these would be published, that anybody could use them. And to do this, I needed two things. One, I needed to improve my understanding of data science and statistics content. And so I did that by attending conferences, and other ways, and I'll talk about that. That's sort of where things went instead of where they were going to go. But I also needed to have the software available for me to actually write the questions. Unfortunately, that technical aspect never happened. And so while I am prepared to write the questions, I didn't have a means to actually write the computer code to do this. So I went a different route. We have an actuarial science major, and we don't have any full-time faculty who are actually certified in any of the areas of actuarial science. And for that reason, and because the Society of Actuaries recently added another 2 exams to their list of exams that were required for actuaries, I wanted to be able to take those exams. And to do that, I had to take some previous exams. And so I ended up studying for an actuarial exam. I was going to take the first exam, the P, probability exam, in July, but I missed that deadline. I ended up taking it in September. But it takes somewhere between 350 to 400 hours of study to prepare for this exam. I had a little bit of a head start because I had actually taken a course in probability in 1980, but I didn't really remember very much from it. So in addition to preparing to be able to write the questions that I wanted to write, I also spent the time studying and preparing for the first actuarial exam, and actually spending time preparing for the statistics and risk modeling exam as well. But I passed the P exam, and so I am one step of 7 away from being an associate of the Society of Actuaries. So, but I did a lot of interesting things and learned a lot that I didn't know.
So my principal sabbatical project was as conductor of La Boheme by Giacomo Puccini at the Mobile Opera in Mobile, Alabama. And aside from the month-long residency that I did there for rehearsals, performances and so on, we had quite a range of ancillary events related to Puccini and his reception. So I gave some talks to local patron organisations and did some work in the local high schools, as well as working full-time on the opera production. In addition to the principal sabbatical project, I took on quite a range of other work, including some guest teaching and guest performing. The first thing I did was a recital on piano with 2 saxophonists at Troy University in Alabama. It was Susan Fancher and Dave Camwell, who used to work at Simpson. And while I was at Troy, I also gave a solo piano masterclass and a masterclass for vocalists. I also did a lecture recital with mezzo-soprano Suzanne Lomler at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus, and that was entitled Minds and Music, and it was about German song repertoire, and we performed and also talked quite a bit about the literary and musical cultural background to the pieces, and that was in part sponsored by the Germanic Studies program at the University of British Columbia. I also spent a week in residence at the University of Memphis School of Music, where I was a guest vocal coach, and I helped them prepare for their upcoming production of Aaron Copland's The Tender Land. So I spent some time working with their graduate program, preparing them for their performance in the spring. I also did some outreach at the Houston High School for the Performing and Visual Arts, and the Alabama School for Fine Arts, the Martha Stillwell School, and the Cobb County Center, both in Georgia, doing some outreach for Simpson, and working towards recruitment from those fabulous high schools.
Okay, so on my sabbatical, I decided to follow up on a departmental initiative that we decided to start offering English as a second language for Simpson students. I have been working on a master's in English as a second language now since 2015. I've been taking one class a semester on top of my teaching load in order to get that done. And I decided that as part of my sabbatical, I would finish my master's degree except for one class, which I'm doing this semester, and create the first of the set of English as a second language classes that would have been taught at Simpson College. The reason that my department is interested in pursuing ESL is because we believe that the definition of diversity at Simpson should include those who are culturally and linguistically different from the rest of the student body, and that we would like to see some culturally responsive teaching take place, culturally and linguistically responsive teaching take place on campus. And so this was my chance then to take our department in that direction and provide some new programming for the college. So I had a little bit of a setback during the sabbatical, so I changed my project. So instead of beginning to create the ESL program for the college, I did do the classes that I was going to do, but I ended up creating a web-based class for C&G about cultural and linguistic diversity. It's called Decoding Cultures. It's one that's been taught in our class before, but never as a web class. We're still getting our 2 cents in there, that diversity includes culturally and linguistically diverse students as well as many others. I have really loved teaching English as a second language to refugees in Des Moines. It's a wonderful thing to provide this service for new Iowans, to help them settle into a new culture and to learn about their cultures as I'm doing it.
My project studied teacher leadership compensation systems in the state of Iowa. Those were developed in 2013 by Iowa legislation, and by the fall of 2016, every school district in the state of Iowa had a TLC program. This legislation created a whole new layer of teacher leaders, including instructional coaches, folks to support technology in the classroom, professional development coordinators, and so on. So my big question was, how can college teacher education programs best prepare their students to enter the teacher leadership system when we as professors have never attended or taught in that kind of a system? So my project had 3 parts. One was a statewide survey. Surveys were sent out to superintendents who then shared that with their teachers. And we asked questions like, what skills do teachers need to fully participate in teacher leadership? And which skills are most important for us in teacher education programs at the college level to teach our students? I also had a great opportunity to observe teacher leadership programs for a total of 6 weeks in 3 different districts. And then finally, I conducted interviews. Those were superintendents, principals, teacher leaders, instructional coaches, and very much so I spoke with beginning teachers to get their experience of entering the program. There were 4 categories that really came to the top of what our students need. The first is collaboration. Teaching is not happening in isolation anymore, and instead it's a very collaborative process. And so what our students need is not group work, but instead how to work as a team, how to know if your team is functioning, and how to fix it if you're in a dysfunctional team. The second idea is communication. We've always taught oral and written communication skills, but this focuses more on giving and receiving feedback, and then also in communicating in difficult situations. The third piece that our students need to join the teacher leadership system are leadership skills. And that sounds like it would be fairly obvious, but what I found was that folks in teacher leadership positions are trained for that particular position. But the piece that was missing was intentional instruction in leadership. So for our students, what is a leader? What are their strengths and weaknesses as a leader? Having them practice that. The fourth area is something that I called enlightened teaching. Many of the interviews, surveys, and observations talked about to be in the teacher leadership system, you needed things like a growth mindset. You needed to be willing to take risks. You needed to be reflective. None of those words seem to capture everything that my respondents were talking about, but the word enlightened seemed to capture that. I gathered resources to instruct college students in those areas and developed a website. I've also had the opportunity to present at the Association of Independent Liberal Arts Colleges of Teacher Education's national meeting, and I have submitted an article of my findings to them. This spring, I'll also present my findings at Critical Questions in Education Conference, which is hosted by the Academy for Educational Studies. So it has been a great opportunity to learn more about teacher leadership, and then to share that with my colleagues in Iowa, and then also my national colleagues who are professors of teacher education in many different locations. So I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for a great sabbatical.
My sabbatical proposal was to do essentially write a manuscript that would be ready for publication after the sabbatical period. So basically it was taking that time to just essentially write, and I was really using my dissertation work that I had done probably 12 years prior at least, to look at that work, more than that, I can't do my math, and to sort of extrapolate a couple chapters out of that to really make an article that would be publishable in some kind of a scholarly journal. So I set about doing that. I did fulfill that, which was great. I was able to really get a almost finalized draft. I had some post-sabbatical work to do to really get it fully refined, and some endnotes and getting photo rights and things of that nature that I had to get in line. But essentially I had done what I had set out to do, which was great, gratifying, and I can tell you a little bit about what I was writing about, which was essentially about a sculptor, Antoine Bourdelle, or Emile Antoine Bourdelle, who worked in the early part of the 20th century, and his work became extremely popularized right after World War I, particularly like from about 1918 to his death in 1931. And just numerous writings around him. I basically look at the writings in terms of their rhetoric, because it's more rhetoric than it is really a kind of factual accounting of the man, and how the use of language and writing around him fed into a very conservative nationalist climate at the time in the 1920s in France particularly, and how they were using art in connection with ideology. So it was a great experience. It was a little frustrating to try to whittle down what was pretty large into something compact like an article, but it was a great process for me to go through. I hadn't really done that in a long time. I learned a lot about myself and my writing. It was kind of nice to go back to my dissertation because I could kind of look at it with a more objective lens, and realizing my writing wasn't all that it ever was in my mind. I could see definite issues, and being able to have a chance to sort of clean that up and reconsolidate ideas and actually have, I think, even more of a clarification of what I wanted to say. So it was a really good experience that way. So
the sabbatical idea really started in fall 2017, I think. Is that right? Yeah. So we applied for it, and The idea was to take a look at the amount of mercury in predatory fish in the Des Moines River or in Des Moines, Iowa, or not Des Moines, Iowa, Des Moines rivers. And so what we settled on, we're looking at catfish. And so there's kind of two things at play, and the terms that we would use would be bioaccumulation and bioamplification. And so the distinction between those two is that in bioamplification, as you move up the food chain, environmental contaminants generally concentrate. Bioaccumulation is when you look at one individual in that species. If you look at it over a period of time, when it's a young fish, it hasn't accumulated a lot of contaminants yet. As it gets older and older and older, then the contamination builds up. And so we were interested in the bioaccumulation in an individual. So generally speaking, the idea would be, let's try to add some clarity to the recommendations that the DNR talks about in terms of consumption of fish. And so can we say catfish above 28 inches or 30 inches or some kind of threshold are no longer safe to eat? And so we started that collecting in the summer of 17, carried that into the summer of 18. I don't know how many fish we caught, probably close to 200 fish. We didn't sample all of those. One of the things that we also wanted to do was try to model, put together a mathematical model of the accumulation of mercury in a fish. And so part of that was to try and figure out how fast fish grow. And so some of the fish that we caught, we actually tagged and then released back into the river. So we caught a bunch of fish. We attempted to analyze the fish in-house, but the levels that we needed to look at would be 50 parts per billion, so about 200 times lower than what we were actually able to see in our standards. And so we ended up sending our fish samples to the State Hygienic Lab up in Ankeny, and then one of the students that I have working with me, Alex Austin, was able to fit that data to the model that he created. When we looked at the model, what we determined is that it has a lot to do with the concentration of the fish, bait fish, that they happen to be consuming. One of the interesting outcomes of this is, we didn't necessarily know it, but the DNR was also carrying on a study that was very, very similar. Instead of just looking at flathead catfish or catfish in general, they looked at a variety of different species in Iowa. And so we've gotten to the point now where we contacted the DNR just to ask some questions, and that led to a conversation where they told us about what they were doing, and we asked if there was some way that we could work together and help. And so one of the interesting outcomes that I think, at least, in sort of a good outcome for our students, is that it looks like in the future we're going to be able to collaborate with the DNR, maybe get some of our students out into the field with their research agents. The other nice outcome for us is the research student that I had most recently, Alex, presented his work at the Regional American Chemical Society meeting up in Ames in October, and then him and I are both going to go to the National American Chemical Society meeting this spring, which in the 9 years that I've been here, I don't think we've sent a student to one of those meetings, and so it's kind of neat to do some work with students and then have them make enough progress to be able to put together a poster in his case and go down to a national meeting where there's thousands of posters being presented and tell people what he did. So.